The sky turned black. The air went silent. A tornado roared over the ridge, unstoppable. Families scrambled for shelter. But it was too late. Then, from the tree line came something no one expected. A long line of wild Mustangs, running with eerie calm, not away from the storm, but toward something else. Toward hope. Without thinking, people followed. What happened next? It's the reason they're still alive today, and why no one will ever look at Mustangs the same way again. The warning signs came quietly. First, the wind died. Not a gradual fade, but a full, unnatural stop, as if someone had shut off the air. Flags on porches sagged. Tall grass in the fields stilled mid-sway. Dust from the gravel roads hung suspended in the air like smoke. All around Ash Valley, the animals noticed first. Horses balked at fences, pawing the earth. Dogs whined and paced tight circles. Cows stopped grazing, their heads lifting as one, ears flicking toward a sound no human could yet hear. The farmers noticed next. Bill Carter, standing on the porch of his ranch house, squinted at the horizon and felt it in his gut. Not a cloud yet in sight, but the air tasted wrong. Too thick, too charged, metallic at the back of the tongue. Behind him, the radio crackled, cutting through the country music with an automated voice that spoke without emotion. Tornado warning. Doppler radar indicates rotation 5 miles west of Ash Valley. Seek shelter immediately. No one needed to be told twice. But even as the message repeated, a deeper silence took hold. The birds vanished, the frogs at the creek fell mute, even the insects disappeared. Then came the color. The sky shifted in seconds, mutating from overcast gray to a sickly green that bled into a black smear along the tree line. Everyone who saw it later said the same thing. It wasn't natural. It didn't look like any storm they'd seen before. The world itself looked bruised. People moved fast. At the school, teachers herded students into the narrow basement hallways. At the diner, locals shoved tables against the windows and pulled terrified waitresses under the counters. On the roads, pickups and minivans jammed into every exit lane, pushing for the state highway. But Ash Valley wasn't built for survival. Most homes had no basements, just shallow foundations sunk into red clay. There was one official storm shelter, an old Cold War-era concrete block buried under the town hall, and it could barely fit 100 people. For the rest, the choices were limited. Ride it out in a closet, hunker down in a ditch, or pray it missed them altogether. At 2:17 p.m., the first sighting came. A black funnel unfurled from the clouds like a rope snapping down, fat and fast and already hungry. It churned across the ridgeline, flattening a grove of maples with a swipe of its skirt. Barn roofs tore free like paper. Grain silos exploded outward in bursts of silver. The tornado didn't weave or meander. It charged in a direct, merciless line straight toward the town. Jamie Reynolds, 16 years old, saw it from the back pasture. He didn't have time to think. He sprinted for the barn, calling for his younger brother. Somewhere across town, emergency sirens finally howled awake, late and useless against the reality tearing across the land. Debris flew ahead of the storm like shrapnel. Sheet metal, fence posts, tree limbs spinning end over end in the gale. A full-sized combine harvester, weighing several tons, was lifted off its wheels and thrown across Highway 10 like a toy. By the time the first houses splintered under the outer bands of the storm, most families were already on the move. But the roads were clogged with panic, trucks stuck in mud, engines stalled, neighbors screaming over the howling wind. In under 5 minutes, the town's power grid collapsed. The last radio transmission cut out mid-broadcast, a voice half-finished warning about ground circulation near Main Street, before static swallowed everything. Those still outside could feel it now, pressure building in their chests, in their sinuses, a roaring so loud it felt less like sound and more like the sky itself being torn apart. And yet, through all the fear, the running, the scrambling for shelter, there was one more thing no one could explain. Just beyond the town's north tree line, where the forest opened into the wide grazing basin, dozens of dark shapes moved, low, fast, silent. The Mustangs had arrived, but they weren't running away. They were running towards something, and someone, though no one knew it yet, would follow them into survival. There was no escape. By the time most people realized the tornado wasn't veering off, it was already too late. The black funnel, thick as a skyscraper and spinning with lethal precision, bore down on Ash Valley with a speed none of the forecasts had predicted. Meteorologists would later say it had dropped hot, formed suddenly, and accelerated straight toward populated ground without the usual minutes of warning. For the families in the fields and along the back roads, there were no choices left. Jamie Reynolds abandoned the pickup the moment he saw the clogged bottleneck at the southbound access road. Trucks, tractors, ATVs, packed together in a frantic tangle, horn blasts useless under the rising scream of the wind. Fathers yanked crying toddlers out of car seats. Mothers sprinted across open fields clutching babies wrapped in blankets. Elderly men tried dragging garbage can lids, mattress pads, anything to throw over themselves when the wall of debris came. The funnel loomed closer, low and solid and utterly relentless. It didn't dance or spin lazily like the ones they showed on the news. It ate everything straight ahead. Fencing, sheds, hay bales, full-grown oak trees, ripped from their roots like weeds and hurled into the boiling air. At the old Miller farmstead, 3 generations of the family crammed into the storm cellar, only to find the door jammed by fallen beams from the collapsing barn. They pounded and screamed, but the noise outside swallowed every sound. At Peterson's grain lot, a man tried outrunning the twister on an ATV. He made it less than 200 yards before the machine lifted off the ground, cartwheeling into a fence and vanishing in a cloud of dust and wood splinters. Closer to town, Main Street was gridlocked with townspeople desperate to get clear. Bill Carter's pickup, engine still running, was trapped between a fallen light pole and a jackknifed delivery truck. He abandoned it, dragging his wife and teenage daughter toward the side alley between the diner and post office. Halfway across, the diner's front windows blew inward in a spray of glass and splinters, and Bill went down, his arms wrapped around his family, trying to shield them from flying debris. The tornado grew louder with every breath. It wasn't just noise, it was vibration, pressure, a physical force punching into lungs and eardrums. Static electricity charged the air so thickly that hair stood straight up on arms and heads. Sparks crackled along the metal gutters and fence posts. Cattle lowed in terror, charging blindly across open yards, hooves tearing up wet ground, eyes rolled white. Inside the elementary school, Principal Dawson ordered the last of the children into the locker-lined basement hallways, teachers throwing themselves over clusters of crying students. Fluorescent lights above flickered, buzzed, and then went dark. The ground shuddered as the outer edge of the tornado scraped the north side of town, peeling rooftops like tinfoil, sending wooden planks slicing end over end across the parking lot. In a farmhouse west of the basin, the Alvarez family had no time for plans. The oldest son, Mateo, grabbed his younger sisters, pushing them into the gap beneath the staircase just as the walls began to creak outward. Their father, Miguel, didn't look toward the storm, he looked toward the horses. And that's when he saw it. At the tree line to the north, moving against the backdrop of spinning debris and shattered fences, a line of Mustangs appeared. They weren't running blindly like the cattle. They weren't scattering. They ran in a clean, unbroken file, shoulder to shoulder, ears pinned, heads low, muscles flexing in coordinated strides. Miguel shouted without thinking, pointing. Across town, Jamie Reynolds, crouched behind a half-toppled shed, caught sight of the same thing. His instincts screamed to stay down, stay hidden, but something deeper, something older stirred inside him. He watched the Mustangs tear across the open field, their bodies blurred by the driving dust, but their movement was unmistakable, deliberate, synchronized. They weren't fleeing, they were leading, and they were heading east, toward the lower basin, toward a stretch of land most people had forgotten about, a place too narrow for houses, too rocky for farming, thick with trees and gullies. For one frozen second, Jamie thought he was imagining it. Animals didn't lead humans. That was fantasy. But then he heard the Alvarez boy yell across the lot, "Follow them!" One rancher took off, hauling his youngest son by the wrist. Two neighbors sprinted after him, heads low. The wind fought every step, pushing them sideways, but they moved anyway, chasing the blur of wild muscle flashing through the storm-gray world. Other families hesitated, clutching door frames, gripping their car doors, torn between survival instincts and logic. The sirens warbled, weak against the sound of the earth tearing apart. Then another voice shouted, Bill Carter this time, bleeding from a cut above his eye, dragging his daughter across the lot. "They know where it's safe!" he roared. That broke the hesitation. Groups of survivors, families, ranchers, teenagers, elderly neighbors, abandoned their vehicles, dropped their useless possessions, and ran. Not away from the storm, but toward the direction the Mustangs were moving. Not everyone made the choice. Some stayed curled behind walls, under cars, in drainage ditches, praying the wind would miss them. But those who ran after the Mustangs didn't look back. The wild horses, lean and ragged from the hard winter, moved with terrifying precision. One gray mare at the front, smaller, faster, kicked her hooves in a sharp arc, driving the herd straight toward the narrow cut in the land that none of the townsfolk even remembered existed. Jamie's boots slipped on wet mud as he sprinted, gasping through air full of grit, clothes whipping against his skin. He ducked as a metal sign twisted loose from a diner awning and flew overhead like a blade. His brother, younger and lighter, ran beside him, clutching Jamie's arm with white knuckles. Above them, the funnel chewed closer. The swirling wall of debris swallowed whole barns in seconds, ripping the ground itself into jagged scars. The Mustangs never faltered. They drove themselves forward, forging a path through the chaos no human would have dared to find on their own. And as Jamie vaulted over a fallen fence post, chasing the last flickers of their tails into the gully, he realized one truth that seared itself into his memory. The only reason he was still breathing was because he had trusted something wilder and older than any warning siren. Something that refused to be explained. Something that refused to leave them behind. Jamie Reynolds had never seen anything move like the Mustangs did that day. He stumbled down the muddy slope of the basin, boots slipping, lungs burning from the grit-laced air, but his eyes stayed locked on the wild horses ahead. There were at least 24 of them, lean, wiry, dust-covered from the winter, their manes shredded by wind and ice. They didn't panic. They didn't stampede in blind terror like the cattle had back at the farms. They moved with cold, mechanical efficiency, heads low, tails pinned, legs driving in perfect, synchronized strides. The led horse was a gray mare, small but sharply built, her ribs showing under her winter coat. Her ears flattened against her skull, and every few strides, she kicked her hind legs sideways, cutting across the herd's path to steer them tighter together. Jamie realized, with a clarity that chilled him worse than the howling wind, that she wasn't fleeing the storm. She was leading them somewhere. Leading them, too. Behind Jamie, a loose knot of survivors fought to keep up. Bill Carter dragging his daughter by the hand, the Alvarez family clinging together, a handful of ranchers and teenagers sprinting through half-frozen mud and twisted fence wire. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Every glance they exchanged said the same thing: follow the horses or die. Overhead, the tornado carved a black gouge through the sky, low and relentless. The outer edges snapped trees in half and sent sheets of rain hissing sideways across the basin. Power lines swung like whips. Entire sheds were picked up, twisted apart mid-air, and shredded into lethal shrapnel. The Mustangs drove forward undeterred. Jamie caught sight of a young colt near the rear of the herd, a thin brown thing barely past its first winter. It stumbled in the churned mud, skidded, almost fell, but the gray mare at the front didn't stop. The herd's momentum pulled the colt back onto its feet. No hesitation, no second chances. Keep moving, or be lost. The land began to change. Jamie noticed it first under his boots. The ground firmed, sloping sharply downward into a narrow gully half hidden by brush and deadfall. The herd poured into it without slowing, weaving through the tight space with uncanny precision. The trees overhead thickened, their bare winter branches tangling into a rough canopy. The sides of the gully rose steep enough that even a trained horseman couldn't climb out without dismounting. They weren't just moving blindly into a low spot. They were entering shelter. Real shelter. The kind deep enough to shield from the worst of the wind. Jamie pushed harder, heart hammering against his ribs. His brother stumbled behind him, and Jamie yanked him upright with a jerk of his jacket. Mud splattered up their legs. His thighs screamed from the effort, but he kept running. Ahead, the Mustangs spread out just slightly inside the gully, their formation shifting without panic. Some pressed against the northern wall. Others wedged themselves into thick clumps of thorn bush and fallen timber, bracing as the wind howled overhead. The gray mare stayed in the center, her body tense but steady, flanks heaving from the sprint. Jamie crashed into the gully seconds later, nearly slipping on a hidden rock, and collapsed against the frozen wall, dragging his brother down beside him. Around him, other survivors dove for cover, ranchers covering their children with their own bodies, elderly couples shielding each other with coats. No one spoke. The only sound was the moan of the storm scraping past above them, furious but unable to reach this narrow hollow. The Mustangs didn't scatter. They didn't bolt deeper into the woods. They stayed, every one of them, heads low, muscles locked, eyes half-lidded against the slashing snow and debris. Jamie looked up once, risking a glance over the rim of the gully. The tornado loomed just a quarter-mile off now, a spinning engine of wreckage tearing through everything in its path. He ducked back down, chest heaving. The gray mare shifted her stance slightly, pressing herself against a cluster of saplings. Her hooves planted wide for balance. Her ears turned toward the roar of the storm, but she didn't panic. She didn't flee. Neither did Jamie. Somewhere in the back of his mind, through the haze of terror and exhaustion, he understood something simple, primal, and absolute. They weren't hiding because they understood physics. They were hiding because they remembered. Generations of survival written into blood and bone. Knowledge no human textbook could teach. When the earth screamed and the skies twisted, the wild ones knew where to go. And for the first time in his life, Jamie was smart enough to follow. At the edge of the basin, caught between the open fields and the deadly wall of wind bearing down, the last groups of townspeople faced a decision none of them had time to explain. Stay, and pray their walls or their ditches held, or run, and follow the wild herd into the unknown. For a moment, everything hung suspended, the world humming with pressure, the air sharp with the smell of rain, soil, and ozone. Time slowed, but only for a breath. The Mustangs gave no second thought. They surged into the gully ahead, carving a path between broken trees and frozen mud, every muscle coiled in urgent, deliberate motion. Their leader, the gray mare, glanced back once toward the people struggling at the rim. An instinct, not a plea. and then continued without faltering. The humans hesitated. At the front, Miguel Alvarez tightened his grip on his youngest daughter's hand. His boot slipped on the wet ground, mud coating his jeans to the knees. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He locked eyes with his wife for a half-second, gave the smallest nod, then shoved forward, dragging his family in the direction the Mustangs had gone. Behind them, others faltered. "Stick to the ditches," someone yelled. "Stay low!" "We can ride it out here," another shouted, pointing at a drainage culvert half buried under debris. Jamie Reynolds didn't wait to argue. He hauled his brother closer to his side, tucked his chin against the wind, and ran. After the Alvarez family, after the herd, after the only hope left that didn't feel like gambling with death. Bill Carter saw them move. His daughter clung to his jacket sleeve, face smeared with mud and blood from a cut on her cheek. Without another word, he abandoned his ruined truck and sprinted after them, boots hammering the soaked earth. Others weren't so sure. 3 families stayed behind, clinging to the shell of an overturned hay trailer. A few crouched inside half-collapsed sheds, heads bowed, eyes shut tight, praying that wood and tin could hold against the fury bearing down. The first sheets of rain slammed down like hammers. The temperature dropped instantly, cutting through clothes like knives. Visibility collapsed into a gray, whipping blur. Overhead, the tornado's leading edge devoured the far ridge, pulling soil, fence posts, entire trees upward in a spiraling column. The roar was beyond anything human ears were built to handle. A rolling, continuous scream vibrating through ribs and teeth and skull. In the chaos, a single instinctual fact remained. Movement was life. Stillness was death. Those who chose to run moved on pure reflex now, feet finding purchase through half-blind momentum, hearts pounding high in their throats. The gully appeared through the driving sleet almost too late. A narrow slit in the land, choked with frozen roots and twisted underbrush, just wide enough to funnel through. The Mustangs were already deeper inside, bodies huddled low against the inner walls. Their coats shimmered with ice, their heads tucked, but they were still standing, braced for the violence overhead. Jamie stumbled first into the cut, landing hard on one knee, dragging his brother down with him. The Alvarez family followed, sliding and rolling, clawing their way into the relative safety of the ditch. Bill Carter threw himself flat at the entrance, pulling his daughter beneath his body to shield her. More followed. 2 teenagers from the Reynolds farm, an old woman from the diner clutching a battered Bible, a farmhand bleeding from a gash across his forehead. They crammed into the hollow, packed shoulder to shoulder with the trembling bodies of the Mustangs, every breath a visible burst of steam. No words passed between them. No one needed to speak. Above them, the full weight of the tornado finally reached the basin. The last thing Jamie saw before burying his head against the mud was a wall of black and brown swallowing the world beyond the gully's rim. Trees bending like rubber, the sky flashing with streaks of green lightning, whole sections of the landscape rising and vanishing into the rotating void. And then they were blind, buried in sound, buried in earth, buried in a moment that would decide who lived and who wouldn't. The gully held, barely. The tornado roared over them with a violence that didn't sound natural. It was a grinding, metallic howl, like a mountain being shredded into sand. Earth and debris hammered the slopes above their heads, rattling branches loose, sending clumps of frozen dirt tumbling down into their cramped shelter. Every blast of wind shoved dust into their mouths and eyes. It was impossible to breathe without choking. Jamie Reynolds pressed himself tighter against the frozen ground. His brother curled beside him, both shielding their heads under their arms. His ears popped from the pressure. His body shook from more than cold. Every instinct screamed to run. But where? There was nowhere left to run, only the thin hope that the narrow ditch, These scraped-out earth walls and the battered trees above would be enough. Beside him, the Mustangs braced too. The gray mare stood halfway up the gully's slope, her thin body taut, hooves planted deep in the mud. Her mane lashed sideways in the screaming wind. She didn't move, didn't bolt. None of them did. The herd compressed itself into a tight cluster, heads down, shoulders locked together. Some pressed against the humans, others dug their hooves deeper for balance. Their instinct told them the truth. Stay low, stay still, stay alive. A deafening crack ripped overhead, a tree snapping at the trunk. The sound rolled through the gully like a gunshot, and a shower of broken limbs and ice pelted the survivors. Jamie covered his brother with his body, feeling sharp branches glance off his back. Someone cried out behind them, a short, clipped scream, but no one moved to help. Movement was death now. Stillness was survival. Seconds stretched into minutes. Minutes stretched into something longer, timeless, formless. They existed only inside the howl, trapped between heartbeats and air that tore at their lungs. The gully walls saved them. The depth, barely wide enough for a man to stretch both arms, created a natural windbreak. The tornado, flattening everything on the open ground above, couldn't funnel its full force down into the cut. Instead, the worst of the destruction passed overhead, ripping roofs, toppling trucks, shattering windows, while the gully absorbed the leftover violence. Still, it was close. Every blast of wind rattled them. Every shockwave of displaced air felt like a giant's hammer striking the earth just feet from their heads. Jamie squeezed his eyes shut against the flying grit, felt blood trickling from a cut on his temple, but forced himself not to move. He could feel the tremors in the Mustangs' bodies too, the way their flanks trembled, not from fear, but from strain. They knew. Every breath was survival, every second was borrowed time. And then, as fast as it had come, the sound began to fade, not disappear. Not entirely, but lessen. The constant screaming collapsed into ragged gusts. The roar retreated into distance. Jamie lifted his head first, squinting through the haze. The sky above was still a swirling gray mess, but the black core of the tornado was already moving east, tearing a scar across the far side of the basin, its grip on the town loosening. He turned and looked at the others. Mud-caked, bloodied, breathing hard, but alive. Bill Carter, lying flat against a rock outcrop, met Jamie's eyes and gave a shallow nod. Across the way, Miguel Alvarez tightened his arms around his youngest daughter, whispering something Jamie couldn't hear. The Mustangs stood still. The gray mare, her sides heaving with exhaustion, shook her head once, sending a spray of ice crystals into the air. She shifted her weight, stepping carefully to avoid the collapsed brush under her hooves. The others moved with her, hooves clopping quietly against the frozen ground. They weren't leaving yet. They waited. Waited until the last gusts of the storm blew themselves ragged over the ridge, until the dust stopped falling like rain, until the world above stopped trying to kill them. Only then did the gray mare lift her head higher, sniffing the wind. Jamie forced his stiff legs to move, crawling up the edge of the gully far enough to peer over. What he saw stole his breath. The town was gone. Ash Valley wasn't a town anymore. It was a flat smear of broken timber, twisted metal, and torn earth. Only the oldest concrete foundations remained. Streets were stripped bare. Trees were snapped at the waist like dry matchsticks. Vehicles lay overturned in ditches. Roofs peeled away. Windows punched through. And yet, inside the gully, surrounded by a trembling herd of battered Mustangs and a handful of battered humans, they had survived. Jamie dropped back down beside his brother, heart pounding. The gray mare turned her head slightly, looking at him from the corner of one black eye. Not wild, not tame, just present. He didn't know what they owed her or the others like her. He only knew they were still breathing because of them. The first step out of the gully felt like stepping into another world. Jamie Reynolds climbed slowly, slipping in the mud, knees screaming from the cold. His brother clung behind him, quiet, still in shock. The others followed at different paces, Bill Carter supporting his limping daughter, the Alvarez family moving as one tight unit, their boots scraping against frozen roots and broken branches. They didn't speak. Words felt too small for what waited above. The gully had been a tomb, cold, dark, protected. But once they reached the rim, the full weight of the storm's destruction smashed into their senses at once. Ash Valley was gone. The tornado hadn't skimmed the town. It hadn't grazed the fields. It had swallowed everything. The school roof lay crumpled like a dropped soda can. The diner where Jamie's mother used to take them after Sunday church was a splintered wreck, a pile of bent tables and torn upholstery half buried in broken asphalt. The grain silos on the west end of town were flattened into spirals of twisted metal. Power lines lay across the roads in snarled black tangles, crackling faintly where they touched standing water. Trucks and tractors, some weighing tons, sat tossed like toys across backyards. Roofs of homes lodged through their cabs like spears. In the far distance, what used to be the church steeple lay snapped in two, its bell missing. There were no sirens now, no engines, no helicopters. Just wind moving through ruins, whistling over broken glass and the shattered bones of the town. Jamie tightened his grip on his brother's shoulder, pulling him closer. His heart pounded, but his thoughts moved slowly, like cold molasses. He couldn't process it all, couldn't make sense of the sheer scale. You didn't think about buildings coming apart like this until you saw it. Footsteps sloshed through the mud behind them. Miguel Alvarez, face grim and bleeding from a cut above his eye, scanned the horizon with hollow eyes. His wife carried their youngest, cradling the girl's head against her chest, both of them covered in soot and ice. Bill Carter stopped at the edge of the road, breathing hard, hands clenched into fists. His daughter leaned against him, her face streaked with blood and dirt. No one cried. Not yet. There was no space for it. The Mustangs emerged last. The herd climbed the gully with cautious steps, slick with melted snow and debris. The gray mare led them, moving carefully across the churned earth, head high, nostrils flaring against the sharp smell of oil, splintered wood, and wet insulation. Jamie watched as the mare reached the top of the ridge and stopped. She stood perfectly still, ears twitching, eyes scanning the ruins. She didn't bolt. She didn't spook. She simply stood there, a lone, battered sentinel facing the aftermath. Around her, the others milled uncertainly, muscles tense, hooves striking nervous rhythms against the broken ground. They didn't belong here, in the ruins of human lives, and they knew it. One colt snorted sharply, tossing his head toward the east where the open hills called them back. The herd shifted, restless. The mare didn't move. She turned her head, looking once toward the humans who had followed them into the gully. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't apology. It was acknowledgement. A shared truth between the wild and the broken. Survival had no favorites, no loyalties. It demanded instinct, motion, brutal decisions made in the instant between breath and death. The wind picked up again, gentler now, pushing tattered clouds across the bruised sky. In its wake, a strange quiet settled, thick, heavy, but alive. Jamie sucked in a deep breath through burning lungs and looked at the wreckage again. They were alive. Against every possible odds, they had made it, because they trusted something older than sirens, older than warning systems, older than fear, because they had followed the ones who remembered. The gray mare shook her mane once, snorted, and turned sharply toward the east. One by one, the herd fell in behind her. Within minutes, the Mustangs disappeared into the misty horizon, their hoofbeats muffled by mud and ash. No one tried to stop them. No one called after them. The people left standing on the broken edge of Ash Valley just watched them go, hollow-eyed and breathless, feeling in their bones the deep certainty of what they had witnessed. Not luck, not miracle, something older, something true. The first hours after the tornado were a blur of silence and movement. The survivors staggered through the wreckage without speaking, without calling out. There was too much to see, too much to understand. What once had been houses, stores, barns, and lives was now a flattened wasteland. Entire streets were erased. Foundations lay bare. Family photos, children's toys, and shards of furniture were scattered across fields like the aftermath of a war. Jamie Reynolds picked his way through the ruins, every step sinking ankle-deep into wet, churned mud. His brother clung to him, their hands locked together so tightly neither noticed the pain. Around them others moved the same way, slow, mechanical, faces blank. There were no rescue sirens yet. No FEMA teams, no police, no ambulances, only the people still breathing, gathering what they could with numbed hands. Bill Carter found his wife alive under a collapsed porch, buried under snapped beams, but unharmed. He dug her free with bare hands, sobbing once, sharp and broken, before standing upright again, face turning to stone. Miguel Alvarez carried his youngest daughter through the ruins of what had been Main Street, stepping over twisted rebar and shattered glass without breaking stride. No one gave speeches. No one shouted for help. The town moved like a wounded animal, slow and instinctive. Later, when the sun finally broke through the shredded clouds, the true scale of it became visible from the ridge. Ash Valley was gone. Not just damaged. Wiped off the map. They would learn later from the news reports. EF4 tornado, sustained winds near 190 miles per hour, a direct hit across 4 square miles. Out of 327 residents, only 116 were immediately accounted for in the first roll call. The ones who had stayed behind, those who had crouched in ditches, clung to overturned cars, hid under trailers, many hadn't survived. The ones who had followed the Mustangs had. Every single one. The realization came slowly. It wasn't spoken aloud at first, but moved through the survivors like a rising current. They would meet each other's eyes in the ruins, muddy, battered, bleeding, and they would understand. We are the ones who ran after the horses. At the remains of the diner, someone set up a crude first aid station. Jamie helped where he could, pressing gauze against cuts, handing out bottled water scavenged from a collapsed convenience store. His mind still reeled, trying to process the gap between life and death, between where they had been and where they had almost been lost forever. The Mustangs were gone. No one knew where they had disappeared to. They had run east, over the broken hills, into the heavy mist still hanging along the low ridges. No tracks remained. The rain had already started to wash away their hoof prints. It didn't matter. Their absence was louder than words. The town's elders gathered by the wreckage of the church steps, one of the few structures still partially standing, and made a decision by consensus, without debate, without ceremony. They would mark the gully. They would honor the herd. It wasn't about superstition. It wasn't even about gratitude, not in the simple sense. It was about recognizing the truth. Survival had come, not from luck, not from human wisdom, but from something wild, something older, something deeply woven into the fabric of the land itself. 3 days later, with battered hands and salvaged tools, the survivors raised a wooden sign at the entrance to the gully. Simple, weathered, built from the scraps of broken homes. It read, "The Mustang's path. Follow the wild. Find your way." No speeches were made. No photos were taken. No officials came to document it. It was for them. The ones who knew, the ones who remembered. At night, sitting around fires built from broken furniture, the survivors would glance eastward into the blackness beyond the ruins and wonder if they would ever see those horses again. Jamie kept a scrap of notebook paper in his pocket with a hand-sketched image, rough, unfinished, of the gray mare who had led them into life. He didn't know if it was enough, but it was all he had, and every time the wind rose in the hills, sharp and sudden, they all listened, hoping for the sound of hooves beating against the earth, a reminder that survival had not been a gift, it had been an invitation, and they had been smart enough, lucky enough, to accept it. Ash Valley did not rebuild, not in the way towns usually did after a disaster. No contractors came to restore the old diner. No blueprints were drawn for new subdivisions. Insurance checks trickled in late, too small to matter. Some families packed up their few salvaged possessions and left, heading east or south, toward cities that offered jobs and fresh starts. Others stayed. They stayed not because of stubbornness, but because of something harder to name, a sense that what had happened here was not meant to be paved over or forgotten. It had been something holy in its brutality, something real. Survival cost too much to treat lightly. By summer, the survivors cleared what little debris they could from the gully's entrance. They dug a clean footpath down the slope, careful not to disturb the heavy earth that had protected them. They mounted the wooden sign higher on a new post, the Mustangs' path. Below it, they added a second line, burned carefully into the grain. Honor what saved you. The gully became a place of quiet pilgrimage. No tourists came. No money changed hands. It wasn't marked on official maps. But every year, on the anniversary of the storm, the people who had been there gathered. Some drove in from other states. Some walked in from the edges of what was left of town. They brought no flags, no speeches, no cameras. Only themselves and the memory. Jamie Reynolds, now older, weathered by years, came every time. He stood at the mouth of the gully with his brother, both of them remembering not the fear, though it never really left, but the strange certainty that had filled them when they had seen the Mustangs running, as if nature itself had opened a hand and offered them a single narrow chance. The gray mare was never seen again. Neither were the others. Locals told stories, of course, that someone spotted hoof prints in the high snow near Ridgepoint, that a rancher saw a flash of gray mane in the mist near the big hollow. But no one captured photos. No one proved anything. It didn't matter. The truth had already been written into the land. Ash Valley was no longer a dot on a highway map. It was a scar carved deep into the memory of those who survived. And a reminder that sometimes, when reason fails and systems collapse, instinct can still save you. And sometimes, salvation comes with 4 hooves and no explanation. In the summers, when the wild grasses grew tall again across the broken fields, Jamie would stand alone at the top of the ridge, watching the wind ripple the earth below. He imagined he could still hear them, the Mustangs, moving somewhere beyond the edge of sight, wild and free, carrying with them the last unbroken thread of the old world, not tamed, not claimed, remembered. He carried a photograph now, not a real one, just a memory burned sharper than film, of the gray mare standing in the ruins, her body battered, her eyes clear, her stance as steady as stone, not fleeing, not afraid, leading. Jamie knew he owed her his life. They all did. And in some unspoken way, the battered survivors of Ash Valley had become something wilder themselves. Not broken. Changed. They had followed the wild. They had found their way. And they had never once forgotten who showed it to them.